Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online. On behalf of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are the traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Welcome. I'm Christina Hartley. I'm the director here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and we are excited for another evening of great discussion, this time about Caribbean American writers. And I do want to just acknowledge and thank our sponsors for the After Uncle Tom's Cabin Black Voices for Justice discussion series. And those sponsors are School Outfitters and Hindman Auctions. So thank you very much to them. And as always, check out our upcoming programs at stowehousecincy.org. We do have one more iteration of this discussion group in December, and then we will be starting to highlight our 2022 programming. I can't believe I'm saying that. 2022 programming, which we've got a whole bunch of cool things lined up for that as well. So with that being said, we're going to get started with our discussion. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor Getz to get us rolling.
Okay, and Chris, do you still have access to that map we were looking at?
I do. Do you want to see the map first?
Yes, let's put that up first, just since it may be that some of you who don't travel regularly in the Caribbean, like me, may need a little refresher on where the two islands are that we're talking about today. So let's start down in the right corner of the map. This is the Caribbean, and there's Barbados, right there being circled. Very tiny island. It's the most eastern island of the Caribbean. It is considered still Caribbean, even though it looks like it's sneaking off into the Atlantic Ocean there. So that's Barbados. That's where the family of Paul Marshall comes from. And we go up to Haiti, right here. It's been described as shaped like a lobster claw. And of course, the boat people from Haiti, and we'll talk about when this happens, but the boat people, as described in Children of the Sea, are making the journey up here past the Bahamas and up to Florida, which I can't see at least because there's a tab in front of it. But
yeah, I don't know if there's a way to get rid of that or not. I don't think so.
The tab is being imperialistic, taking over the region here. Well, okay, anyway, that's Florida. It's a journey of about, as I roughly measure it, 600, 700 miles, something like that, from Haiti. Certainly, if you start in Port-au-Prince, which it seems like the people in Children of the Sea do, then you've got to get around a good share of Haiti first. That adds about 80 miles to the trip. And then you'd go up this way past the Bahamas. Some people would try to get off at the Bahamas and then try to get another boat to go to Florida right here, or just try to go right ahead to Florida. But it's, I think, about 600 or 700 miles. And of course, when you're at sea, you're going at the mercy of the wind and the storms and everything else. So, okay, that's just a little picture of the people, the scene from Children of the Sea, and to know where these two islands are that we're talking about. Let's go to the timelines now, and I will talk about that a little bit. Barbados. We tend to overlook the indigenous populations of these islands sometimes when we talk about their history, but there was a Spanish trade. Spain as early as the 1400s or the 1500s showed up and enslaved much of the native Kalinago population, so that and many of them died off also from disease. So they were not in significant numbers by the time the English come along in the 1620s. And it is the English who dominate, who really are the colonial power in Barbados. starting with indentured white servants, especially the Irish, but then introducing sugarcane just a couple decades after the English arrived. And that meant the slave trade and bringing in many enslaved Africans, thousands of them who would eventually outnumber the white population dramatically. Unrest, slave issues, or rebellion, or resistance by the enslaved people certainly happened, but the controlling British were in such control that Barbados became known as Little England because it was the most thoroughly, talking about the controlling class here, the most allied with England of any of the Caribbean islands. And the people who ran Barbados were very proud of that connection. But resistance grows, and 4 days of rioting in 1937 followed the deportation of labor leader Clement Payne. This leads to what is referred to in the story in To Dada in Memoriam. It leads to what's called the Strike of 37. I think that's what she's referring to. When she calls it the Strike of 37, it's those 4 days of rioting and protest over the deportation of one of their leaders. And the British response, of course, was strong, and the planes flying over the sugarcane fields, flattening these large cane plants by flying so low to intimidate the black population. But it did lead to reforms and eventually to independence for Barbados by the 1960s, or a kind of independence within the British Commonwealth, still acknowledging Queen Elizabeth. But later this very month that we're talking, the first president of Barbados is scheduled to take office, and the country will officially no longer acknowledge Elizabeth as its monarch. So this history is still being made this month. If we turn to Haiti, good old Christopher Columbus again, you can blame for the first contact with the indigenous Taino population. And of course, he claimed the island of Hispaniola. You need to remember, Hispaniola is an island that's 3/8 Haiti and the other 5/8 the Dominican Republic today. So he claimed the whole island for Spain. Again, the native population, the Tainos, are decimated by diseases brought by the Spaniards and by a forced labor system for gold mines and plantations. That's in the 1500s. Eventually, Spain, a treaty between France and Spain split the island into roughly the two, what we have today as two countries, not then, two colonies back then. And by the 1700s, it's sugar and coffee plantations that lead to importing of vast numbers of slaves. And in fact, Saint-Domingue, which is what the French called this colony that would become Haiti, becomes France's richest possession of all their colonies. This is the most financially remunerative to France, not to the Haitian population who were doing all the work. Revolution, 1791 to 1804, you know the name probably Toussaint Louverture, make Haiti the first country to gain independence through a revolt by the enslaved people. The US, however, will not recognize Haitians' independence until 1862, and you might be able to figure out why. 1862 is during the Civil War. The South has seceded. It was the Southern planters, of course, who did not want to encourage a revolt by enslaved people. And so they stalled recognition of Haiti until they eventually seceded and weren't around to protest at that point. But France came back demanding money to recognize Haitians' independence. They never had completely acknowledged it. And so they imposed a huge tax on Haiti. And people wonder why Haiti is in typically such terrible economic condition. Well, talk about accumulating wealth. Large sums of money from the Haitian economy. Once they gained independence from France in 1826, they were paying huge reparations to France. At one point, it was calculated that 80% of the economy was devoted to either debt service. And they borrowed a lot of money from the US and from other countries, and so they had a big debt to pay off. They didn't finish paying this off until 1947, after World War II, finally. And it was a huge burden that the country bore. And there was a lot of instability. Some of you readers of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin might remember that late in that book, George Harris writes a long letter explaining why he's moving to Liberia with his family. And he says that he considered Haiti at that point. You're going to hear some pretty nasty things he has to say about Haiti, and they reflect, not the best on Harriet for putting these words in his mouth. He says, the desire and yearning of my soul is for an African nationality. I want a people that shall have a tangible, separate existence of its own. And where am I to look for it? Not in Haiti. They had nothing to start with. A stream cannot rise above its fountain. The race that formed the character of the Haitians was a worn-out, effeminate one. Presume he's talking about France here. Nice slur against the French. And of course, the subject race will be centuries in rising to anything. Now, in the early 1850s, Haiti was at the time Beecher Stowe wrote this, Haiti was in all sorts of intermittent violent conflicts with the Dominican Republic for control of the island. Each wanted to dominate the other and control the island. And Haiti at that time was ruled by General Faustin Soulouque, who declared himself Emperor Faustin I. He didn't last long. He was eventually deposed. But you can see why George would have been wary of Haiti, but the terms in which it's expressed are not very kind.
And of course, Liberia was another kind of worms there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that takes you to the 1850s. The US enters the picture from 1915 to 1934 and occupies the country, supposedly to restore order. Well, there was a need to restore some order, but it was certainly also to advance United States interests. They install a pro-US president and a new constitution written by young Franklin D. Roosevelt. Okay, then the Duvaliers come in starting in 1956. Papa Doc Duvalier, dictator, has his private militia, the Tonton Macoute, that means boogeymen, and uses them. And they endure even after the Duvaliers are gone, as you see from Children of the Sea. Duvalier declares himself president for life. He's backed by the United States, but a terrible dictator. And his son takes over when he dies. And then Jean-Bertrand Aristide, finally, they get rid of the baby Doc. And Aristide is in Haiti's first truly free elections with a large electorate. They elect Aristide, but the army kicks him out in a coup in 1991, which then provokes a large number of boat people, about 40,000 in the early 90s, until Aristide was restored to power. And that's where Children of the Sea comes in, those boat people. Okay, quick look at Paul Marshall and Edwidge Dantecat before we let other people talk. Marshall was born in Brooklyn, but her parents were Barbadian immigrants. She made an extended visit to Haiti as a 9-year-old, much like the narrator in Tudada in Memoriam. She created her own name. Her middle name was Pauline, but she changed it to Paul, P-A-U-L-E, with a silent E, in order to honor Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poet from Dayton that she admired so much. She starts writing, publishing fiction. Her first book is Brown Girl Brownstones, their best known book in 1959. Langston Hughes boosts her career by taking her on a State Department world tour to give readings of their works. And we keep seeing Langston Hughes come up in a lot of these discussions as a patron or a guide for younger writers. Alice Walker, for one, too. Dada in Memoriam is published in '67. 2 years later, Edwidge Dantecat is born, so she's definitely the next generation. And she's born in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, the capital city. Her parents immigrate to New York. She's still in Haiti for a while, but eventually joins them in a Haitian neighborhood in New York. And From the Ocean Floor was the earlier name of this story in 1993, and then it becomes Children of the Sea when it's published in Crick Crack, a wonderful short story collection from 1995. And she's still going strong as a writer. Paul Marshall died in 2019. So that's, I think, enough of a background, unless Mitch wants to add anything to that.
I think you did a great job, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Well, let's turn it over to you then to pose the first question for discussion.
All right, so the first question we are going to tackle is on Tada in Memoriam. And the question is, so do you think the narrator of the text loves her grandmother? And so we'll just begin by thinking about that question, and maybe, you know, as I hear your own reflections, I might ask other follow-up questions as we go further.
Dan?
Yeah, I think she loves her grandmother very much, but I'm going to put a but in here. She thinks her grandmother is a little strange, that she does not understand what's happened in the new world. Mm-hmm. And that's held the other way too. Her grandmother thinks she's very strange and that she doesn't appreciate what's in the older world.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. I think there's that. You're absolutely right. There is that cultural encounter, right? You know, between the granddaughter and grandmother, each coming from very different worlds, right? You know, and in many ways, kind of like the granddaughter reconnects, right, with that aspect of her parents' heritage, right? You know, by going back, right? You know, but what did they, some of you others think about the daughter between grandmother and granddaughter? You know, specifically, I'm thinking about how the grandmother keeps, you know, referring to, you know, New York in particular, and saying, "Oh, you don't have this there, right? You know, I bet you don't know about this, right?" What do you make of this kind of like rhetorical gestures on behalf of, that the grandmother constantly does?
Hi, I'm new to your group, and I know one of my colleagues had actually forwarded this invitation to me. The link that you sent, I guess, for the excerpt that's supposed to be read for tonight didn't work. So I was wondering if a chance, maybe later on, if you could just post in the chat, just so I can read at a later time, because I'm not sure how much I can contribute without having read.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one thing for me, you know, one thing that I think really resonated for me with this particular short story is the grandmother's need to affirm the validity of her world, right? You know, of where, you know, especially to her grandchild, right? You know, and part of the way she affirms, right? You know, the fact that this space from which a grandchild comes is valid, right? You know, that you know, and to enable her grandchild to appreciate this space is constantly by placing it in competition, right, with New York, right? You know, with the space where her grandchild is from, right? By saying you might have been born and come from this other cultural environment, right? But this space, let you discover this new space in which you now find yourself, and this new space has something to teach you, has deep roots, has its history, has all these wonderful things to teach you. And you know, I consider it to be even more valuable in certain ways than the space that you know, right? You know, so I'm very curious about, you know, the grandmother's need to constantly, right, exalt, right, you know, her home country, right, you know, her place from which she comes from. And this is something, this is mainly a story about the diaspora, right, and living in the diaspora, right, and the children of those living in diaspora's attempt to reconnect, you know, and come back and revisit, right, you know, their grandmothers. I know that as someone myself was lived extensively in the diaspora, or my cousins who are born outside of their country of birth, whenever they come back to Kenya, right, you have people who have very similar rhetorical gestures, right, you know, of saying, you know, you are born in this other space, but I want you to have a deep sense of understanding where you come from, right? I want you to have a deep sense of understanding those roots, right? You know, but it's you know, so it's about that encounter, right, between the children of the diaspora and those who are behind, right? You know, and I thought we could have a conversation about you know, where that cultural encounter leads, right? You know, and the kinds of understanding that the grandchild is able to have as a result of this cultural encounter with her grandmother. Yes, Rebecca?
You know, I thought that one line was interesting, right? When the grandmother asks her if there's anything taller than the cane. And she says, like, at that moment, she almost wished she could have said no. You know, and it's after that, you know, and so I thought that was really interesting, like, you know, kind of thinking about why is it that she felt she couldn't say no? Like, it's obvious she knows how this is going to make her grandmother feel, like the reaction it's going to have. And so to me, that, you know, that indicates a measure of love and potentially even understanding, you know, but still she feels like, you know, she has to almost kind of tell the brutal truth at the same time.
Yeah. And what do we make of the, you know, I thought about the end of the story, right? At the end of the story, right? You know, so the grandmother is always, and there's a vulnerability to the grandmother, right? You know, she feels vulnerable, you know, and towards the end of the story, there's this description of, right, you know, the planes that come and destroy the grandmother's world, and she stays behind, and you know, basically very soon after, you know, is found dead. But the story also ends with the granddaughter, I think, having bought an apartment in New York, right? Or rented a place in New York, right above, right, a factory, and deciding to paint, right, all the, you know, the landscape, right, you know, that her grandmother was showing her, you know, during her stay in you know, back in Barbados. So you know, I thought that ending was very significant, right? You know, because to me it seems like, you know, you know, as very often happens with people in diaspora, is they become these hybrid, right, subjects, right, people that are from both worlds, and it seems that she has carried with her the world of her grandmother, right, which has not disappeared, right, and which then morphs, right, with this space, this factory space in New York, this mechanized space in, you know, in New York, you know, but that she still, that mixes with the painting, right, you know, that she's still putting forth within that space, right, you know, so that world of her grandmother still intrudes, right, and follows her even as she lives in, you know, back in New York, and I think that, you know, in that way, the short story is a fantastic testament to, you know, I think the cultural politics of in many ways living in the diaspora, right, and being part of two worlds, right, and I think the one thing that those who, you know, it could be either parents, grandmothers who are left behind, right, you know, in the home country, or it could be the parents, right, the first generation. The one thing they always fear is that the culture that they brought with them will be erased, that will not become part of the heritage of their children and their descendants, right? You know, and I think, maybe that was also the grandmother's anxiety, and this is something that we see the granddaughter eventually being able to navigate quite successfully at the end, right? Of still holding on and keeping that culture within her paintings, right?
Dan,
What
you
if there
wanna-
is? Mhm.
Yeah,
Dan has a comment.
I think that I think they both accidentally or maybe purposefully talked past one another.
Mhm.
I think that every time the grandmother said something to her granddaughter, she wanted the granddaughter to say, "Oh, wow, this is cool."
Yes.
Every time that the granddaughter told the grandmother something, especially about the height of this, and then the height of we have a building that's taller than that hill, I think she wanted to have her grandmother go, "Oh, wow, cool." But both of them took them as not, "Oh, wow, cool," but as affronts.
Mhm.
And I think that taking as affronts was more accidental than purposeful. I think that this were talking past one another.
Mhm.
It occurs to me that we've got all this cultural clash or this cultural diaspora thing going on. But let's look at it all for a minute on a very, very fundamental level. The grandmother is a matriarch. And what is happening is the granddaughter is coming in and is cutting her off at the knees. She's challenging her matriarchy without necessarily knowing that consciously, but the grandmother who has lived in a matriarchal situation and who has had the position and the power is finding that her own granddaughter is whittling her down and whittling down what was important to her. And there's verbiage in this piece that I think is especially important. She starts words like doom, and she starts to languish, and she kind of retreats, and you can see her withdrawing and pulling into herself. The matriarchal blossoming and the matriarchal power has essentially, she's been emasculated, if you can use that for a matriarch. And while I think everything you said about the whole cultural revolution and the changes that are so wonderfully illustrated here are probably paramount, at the same time, that whole question of deterioration of family structure and deterioration of family relationship it touched me emotionally very strongly. I felt for both characters because, as Dan said, they talked past one another, and they were doing things to each other that neither of them could quite identify as being, what's the problem here? But we, as the outsider, kind of observe that a little bit more closely.
Yeah, you're right. There is a challenge that the granddaughter poses, right, to the grandmother. I think the first example that we can see is when there's this scene when some people around, members of the community, local members of the community, are fawning over the granddaughters, clothes, or oh, you're from New York, and they're excited, and the grandmother is not really, is not happy about it. I think that was on if I can read it very briefly, because I think it really relates to what you just said here. She said, the women wearing bright pink dresses, the colors vivid against their darkness, the men rustly black suits that encased them like straitjackets that are holding fast to my hand became my anchors. They circled around us, so there's people circling around her like a nervous sea, exclaiming, touching us with their calloused hands, embracing us shyly. They laughed in odd bursts. But look, Adri got big children. See the nice things they wearing, wristwatch and all. I tell you, Adri has done all right. She's self in New York, right? and Dada, right, the grandmother, ashamed at their wonder, embarrassed for them, admonish them the while, right? But maybe we can think of that also as the beginning of this challenge, right? Where they're, for a grandmother who feels that, there's a sense of pride to her own sense of identity, her own sense of place, right? And all of a sudden, these people coming from New York, right? And they're swooning all over, right? Their clothes and their watches and so on and so forth. So she needs to reassert this cultural capital, right? And put things in their right place, right? So
Amy?
that's yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say, Amy, you want to go ahead? Amy, you're still on mute.
Yeah.
Okay. No, she'll come back at some point. Keep going.
I wonder if that's this whole thing that we're talking about is the reason that the British flyover by the planes is so devastating. She dies, not directly because of that. She's waning anyway, but that seems to be, it's at least the occasion that pushes her over the brink. And it's a reminder that all this wonderful island that she's trying to sell to her granddaughter, is actually has been transformed by British colonialism. All the sugarcane, most of the plants that she cites are not native plants from Haiti. They're imports that that Britain brought in and started raising for profit there. So
yeah, I was thinking about
here come the Brits
too.
Again.
Yeah, and like with that idea of like the mechanized, like the grandmother obviously at the beginning has that fright and it's, like right after learning that the Empire State Building is taller than the sugarcane, that's when like sort of like this, like the symbol of the planes, the British, or Euro-American, planes coming in to cut down the sugarcane sort of works as that, metaphorically alongside, the granddaughter's kind of cutting down of her, image of the value of the island.
Yeah. So maybe we can also get to the second question, and which is about children of the sea. So why do you think there is this really horrendous scene in Children of the Sea where the Tonto Makut are basically barging into the neighbor's house, and one of the narrator who's writing this letter, right, recounts this traumatic event about how the father and the entire family kind of like a hiding, right, as they hear their neighbor basically being killed, right, in the process of being killed. And I guess this question is, in Children of the Sea, why do you think the young woman's father doesn't try to save the neighbor, Madame Roja? Do you think he should? Yes.
Yeah. So, he's scared. I mean, he comes right out and tells you in just 2 sentences or 3 sentences why it's happening. The woman next door has undergone just total trauma in the past several days. I mean, she's found her son's head and walked around the city displaying the head and saying, "See what they did to my son." She buries the head, and then another day later, the Tata Makut come to her house, not knowing, because there's such a gang, and asking for her son.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's a big fight about that, of course, and they're going to beat her to death. And the wife says to her husband to go protect her. And then it's very clear, it's like done in 2 sentences. You can't just ignore her because you're afraid. And he says directly, yes, you can. You can't ignore her because I'm afraid. And secondly, the terrible thing he says is that they are now the government.
Yes.
And we must follow the law to be good citizens.
Yeah.
So he's very clear in 2 sentences why he's not doing it. it's hard to say what you would do in that situation with people beating other people to death with guns. But nonetheless, he's very clear that he believes that's the law, and to be good citizens, we must not challenge them.
Yeah. And there is, right, we sense there is, yes?
Do you think he really believes that though, Dan? Or is he using that as
obviously, Joanne asked, obviously through the rest of the story, he is totally frightened through almost the entire story. And he just wants to get out. And so he's trying to keep a low profile through most of the story, and wants his whole family to do the same thing. So no, I don't believe he thinks it, but he's got to have something to say to his wife. I'm not going over there because I am afraid. And that's okay to be afraid.
Okay, and that thing, and then I agree with you too. Then that the statement about we're the government means we have to follow what the government says. He doesn't necessarily believe it on one level, but he knows that to save his family's life, he has to give them a rationale.
Right.
He's also obviously a very bright daughter who needs answers. And while the two of them have a lot of struggles between them, his ultimate goal is really to protect her more than anything else in the whole wide world.
Yes.
Right.
It's so brutal and so loving.
Right.
There's so much brutality and so much love coming through at the same time in this piece.
Right, and the style that he used to go one chapter from him, a chapter from her, chapter from him, chapter from her, is amazingly, actually adds to the sad story a form of beauty.
Yeah. Anyone else has insights about this particular text? Yeah.
I had an expectation that somehow it was going to work out that somebody found his book.
Yes.
And of course they didn't. I mean, it's all fiction, and it's all her fiction.
Yes.
And actually most of it, she was writing it on slips of, the back of labels and everything she could find. And I kept thinking, all right, so this is going to end with somebody finding his book. And then I realized, no, it just vaporized. But here it is in the story. It was a really interesting device, I thought, very interesting device.
That reminds me a lot of even like, sort of the postmodern kind of contemporary neo-slave narratives, particularly the ones that have been, like Toni Morrison, Octavia Butler or whatnot. And this idea of even historiography where, for particular people who've been through these, like essentially genocides, like those diaries and those journals and those records don't exist. And what we do have is beloved, and what we do have is kindred, and what we do have are these stories.
Yes.
And that sort of like kind of expansiveness that we need to have when we think about the historical record, in order to provide like space and voices for these people who have essentially been erased, and I thought it was particularly poignant in that moment when the older man who was interested in the diary has him write his name out.
Yeah.
Right before the diary, essentially is lost.
It's lost, yeah.
Yeah, like just sort of that like the symbolism of that when we think about like historical erasures.
Yeah. It's a gesture that we've seen among, it reminds me of the work of like Maurice Condé's I Tituba, right? Where Maurice Condé says, hey, there is not much historical record about this person because they focused on other people surrounding her. And so I'm going to create this work of fiction, right? as a way of filling that void, and fiction as a way of giving justice, and maybe allowing the memory of what is lost to be able to live on, but in another form, right? Yeah. So yeah. And speaking of that moment, right? It's not just the kind of the thing that he's riding on that disappears, right? That he has to throw. But even before that, there's this woman who's pregnant on the boat, and she she gives birth to a child, and of course the child is the product of the brutal rape of the Tonton Macoute, right? And she gives birth to this child, and she cannot visibly accept the child's death, right? The child is born dead, and she has to, come to terms with the fact that her newborn is dead, and she holds the child for a while, and then as soon as she throws the child overboard, she follows the child, right? And I, I just thought we could maybe reflect on I think that very powerful moment of the text as well, and what you thought its significance was.
I was thinking of the Zong massacre, and some of the, kind of the Middle Passage slave ship, with like pregnant, enslaved women, all of the like being chained together and thrown overboard to drown. And it sort of made me think about the way that we have this idea of like progress in the world, but here we see something that in many ways is very similar, but like in a very contemporary setting.
Yeah, I had to stop my reading at that point with the image of the Coke bottles bobbing up and down and then sinking, the two of them together, the mother and the child. A filling bottle that's bobbing and then fills up and sinks to the bottom. I just had to stop and pick up later. It's a very, very sad moment in the book.
Curiously, at the beginning of the narrative, he talks about the fact that, thank goodness, there are no children on board. I'm so glad we don't have any children on this boat. And, well, the pregnant girl was only 15. I would think of her as still being a child. And, of course, she did have an unborn child as well. And the irony of when the child is born and of course is dead, what he keeps saying is, it doesn't cry, it doesn't cry, it doesn't cry. And you know that it's not alive. That, well, there are two children on board and now they're not. As if the consistency continues in a very heartbreaking way. But he also makes reference to feeling like what it's going to feel like when he goes under, and and he talks about being at the bottom of the sea and his dreams of being at the bottom of the sea. So in a sense, what happens to the pregnant woman and her baby is almost a foreshadowing of what the rest of them can expect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's in a way, the child being able to survive maybe would have, in a different way, foreshadowed some maybe different future, right? And hope, but that child ceases to exist, right? And the mother then, the 15-year-old child also, right, loses hope and decides to jump on board. You're absolutely right. There's a foreshadowing, I think, of what will happen, right? Because and we only read about him through his story, through the letter that he writes, and we also know that letter, also gets to be drowned, right? Also gets overboard. Yeah.
You know, the other, when you're talking about hope too, the other thing that just pops up occasionally is the university exams.
Mhm.
And his girlfriend reassures him that she's following that closely and that she'll let him know when they announce whether or not he has passed his exams. And knowing for someone at that age, and certainly in that situation, to have gotten so far that he's gone through the university, he's passed his exams, he's got so much potential for leadership and
Yes.
for community growth and for the future of that country. And she writes at some point, "Oh, you passed your exams," and that it becomes like a so what?
Yeah.
You know, it's the, you know, the important things in life that somehow become not so important, you know, when you're trying to just truly survive.
It's people being reduced to bare life, to bare existence, right? You know, as he's on that boat, and at that point it doesn't matter that he's passed the exam, and he'll probably maybe not survive that journey. There is that moment on the boat when I think he encounters, right, this story of this person who had previously made the trip and talks about, right, the asymmetric relationships between how Cubans also escaping, right, their own forms of political terror coming to the United States. But of course, the policy of the United States is different at that point, where, you know, as soon as you land on US American soil, then as a Cuban, you can have residency. But for Haitians, right, you know, they get to be deported, right? And this person had supposedly made the trip once and was sent back, and now, you know, ostensibly is coming back with the proper documentation. So we also get the sense that even if they survive the trip, right, there is no guarantee that, you know, if they're caught by the Coast Guards, they'll be allowed to stay. So there is this, this sense of hopelessness that just permeated the whole text. You're not just the baby, but the entire political situation, right, that these people crossing the seas, you know, found themselves in.
I was just put in mind of recently in the news, you know, with the Haitians who were attempting to come up from South America, you know, and very much a similar, you know, like, you know, making it, you know, essentially right to the Texas border. And just how that was, I mean, that was a lifetime's journey in a way, you know, just to be sent back. And, you know, that particular character, you know, put me in mind of, you know, what has just happened literally, you know, a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
And that's a double burden for them, because they haven't lived in Haiti for a while. They've been living in South or Central America. And for a year or two, they've already left Haiti. And then here they are trying to come to the United States, and they get sent to Haiti. They haven't been for a while. Situation is really crazy.
Yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
My connection was a bit, I was thinking also about the gendered dimensions of this text, right? Because there is one moment in the text when he's writing to his girlfriend who stayed back in Haiti, and he said, "Oh, you know, in some way, you know, I envy you because, you know, you didn't have to participate in politics, you know, and you didn't have to be sent away." And it's although like he imagines the political sphere to be, you know, kind of like this male space, right? You know, that he sees himself, you know, as a man, as taking part, right, in political activities, whereas, you know, she's denied, right, you know, that public space. But yet, on the other hand, right, we have examples on which kind of like the politics of that nation, right, and the brutality of that politics, right, is inflicted on women's bodies, right, you know, in very horrendous ways, right? And so her herself, she cannot escape that politics, but yet at that moment, it's as though he sees her outside, right? Of some of those political processes that he was a part of. I was wondering what you all thought about that gender dimension of this text.
Well, it's certainly reinforced by what the Makud are doing, forcing sons to have sex with their mothers and daughters with fathers, and that whole absolutely abhorrent attack on family, on just trying to destroy the morale, the will of anybody to resist.
Yeah. Where it's not enough to kill, right? Part of the strategy is about destroying people's sense of family and sense of identity within that family, right? It's a violence, which in by the way, it's even more horrifying, right? In that way,
yeah, and it's and like you said, I mean, the women, although they don't have the option of participating politically, the female narrator and the next door neighbor both pay the penalty for the son and the boyfriend's political activity. She's just fortunate, the narrator, that her father was able to pay the bribe, or seemingly she would have met the same fate, I'm assuming, as the next door neighbor.
Which is another reason he doesn't want to intervene to try to help Madame Roger, because he's spent all his money to try to preserve his daughter, and the little bit of money he's got left is to get them out of town.
Yeah.
So if he's as he sees it, it's all he can do to protect his family. He can't do anything for her, and he wouldn't be able to anyway.
Yeah.
If he tried to intervene, he would just be killed, and his whole family would be tortured anyhow.
Yeah.
The pregnant girl also, I think, ties very much into that that gender dynamic as well. The story being that they came, they took her brother away and they raped her. And what could she do to protect herself? But when they left, she mutilated her face and gave herself scars, and then realized that she was pregnant and, ended up drowning on the boat. But it's such a symbol of not only the woman, but the children and what the effect is on them, the drowning family.
Yeah.
The hopelessness of all the families are experiencing, and certainly the feminine perspective on that.
Yeah.
Well, that might be a good segue into our third question, since we're talking about women's issues. The epilogue, Women Like Us. How do you think Dantecat justifies being a writer when her mother seems so against it? It's a story about her mother telling her, don't be a writer, and she's telling a story about that. How does she get away with that? Or why would she continue?
And of course, she has this legacy, right? The text is all about the legacy of these women, right? That she's a part of. That relationship between kind of like braiding hair, right? As a continuation and as a way to connect to that legacy, and her attempting to kind of like relate that to the process of writing, right? But of course, the mother is saying, we sacrificed so much for you, why did you decide to be a writer, right? That, it seems from the mother's perspective that she's not, that that writing is not a way of honoring that legacy, and the text is somehow attempting to argue the opposite, right?
But Mom, I see everything differently from the way you see it. You know, I'm a new generation and I don't see it quite that way. When she says, you know, my writing soliloquies, similes and soliloquies whose diction and je ne sais quoi daily slip into your survival soup. There are such wonderful metaphors in here. John and I had previously had a brief conversation about this, and I said to him, I was only 2 or 3 pages into it, and I said, this isn't a short story, this is a poem. The entire thing is a poem, and it's absolutely gorgeous. You know, the whole, the repetition of each section, that whole repetition of, you know, the mothers and the grandmothers and the great grandmothers, and we've always done it this way, and the repetition of what the mother says. But then each time there's a repetition, there's also a kind of re-examination and a turning or a twisting into a new direction and a new thought process, and a certain justification, but not so much justification as just trying to explain why she has to do this, why it's in her heart to do this. I just loved this piece. It's gorgeously written, and it just speaks to me in a lot of ways. I really enjoyed it. And I'm not crying, I have a cold.
Did anybody see any similarities between this piece and Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens that we talked about one of the other sessions? If anybody was around for that, some of you were. I think it's that same idea of thinking back through the foremothers, through the that there really is a tradition to rely on.
Yeah, there's definitely one could read in Black womanism, right? You know, as something that definitely, yeah, I think is captured here as well, right? Yeah.
The kitchen poets. That's what they were called, and that's what she calls them. What does she mean? How does that, it's, let's see, somewhere I wrote down are there women who cook and write? Kitchen poets, they call them. They slip phrases into their stew and wrap meaning around their pork before frying it. They make narrative dumplings and stuff their daughters' mouths so they say nothing more. Who are these? What does she mean by calling her ancestors kitchen poets?
Maybe it goes back to the idea, and I don't remember when or where we were having this conversation, but goes back to the idea that for generations, there's art that's being done that's not necessarily what we would think of as high art. That there's, you know, textiles, and there's cooking, and there's other forms of art that are used through generations that, you know, you don't think of them as a poet, but they are. Does that make sense? Sort of.
That's In Search of Our Mother's Garden.
Okay, good. I was like, that's where we had that conversation. All right.
And that even the cooking, the cooking is a kind of art, a domestic art, but also they're talking while they cook. They're kind of making, so I think cooking becomes another metaphor for telling stories, for making art, and so these earlier mothers and grandmothers were artists in their own ways.
Yeah. And the oral, right? The oral tradition that's part of that, right? Even here it captures like the creak and, crack, right? The call and response, right? That is part of that oral tradition. It's captured as an extension of that craft, right?
Yeah, and I know Amy typed something like that idea of the traditions being passed that way. Yeah. And I would imagine, obviously here, the author, she feels like she's, honoring them like in the deepest, most profound way. Mm-hmm. I would imagine, recording these things and that she feels like she's paying them a tribute. But to them, it is the worst thing that she could be doing, this idea that you're spitting in our face and you're rejecting us, and kind of asking that question then, well, what do we owe? What do we owe our parents and our grandparents? And and it makes me even think about, I'm from an Appalachian background and first generation college, and this, it's my parents, when I said I was going to get an English degree, it's well, what does that mean you can be? What are you, this idea that well, what are you going to do? English? You're going to English? And it's the same for them. We need a nurse. We need just this, and then what is it that we owe, mm-hmm. Because of the sacrifices that previous generations have made for us.
Yeah. I really loved the part when she writes, when she was done, she would ask you to name each braid after those 999 women who were boiling in your blood. And since you had written them down and memorized them, the names would come rolling off your tongue. And this was your testament to the way that these women had lived and died and lived again, right? So the naming, this act of recollection, right? As connected to braiding hair, right? Then that gets captured, right, in the story that's being written down, is her answer, right, to the family, right? This is why it matters, yeah.
And I think it's neat the way the story begins with her braiding her own hair, but it ends with a memory of her mother braiding the daughter's hair, which leads me to ask a question. Do you think the mother completely doesn't want her to be a writer? Certainly she's concerned, what can you do with it? You'll get in trouble if you're a writer in Haiti. If you're a man, you get killed. If you're a woman, you're raped. So it can have horrible consequences. But it's almost as if in telling these stories and making her name all these earlier mothers, grandmothers, that the mother is planting the seed of the storyteller in her. And I think there's a part of even the mother who wants her daughter to go on and tell these stories and to be a writer, even though for the daughter's own good, she's saying, don't do it. Mm-hmm. I think there's kind of a double consciousness maybe going on in the mother as she's presented here. She's sort of saying to the daughter what she feels she has to say, but in her heart, maybe there's something else. Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's because, with the nature of a mother-daughter relationship, it's okay, I know you're going to do the opposite of what I say. So yeah. I'm going to say this because I'm really thinking this.
Yeah. Oh, and I think Amy writes, the traditions are passed through recipes and the time spent together. I wonder if there is a difference between the acceptance of oral tradition versus writing it down. Yeah.
So it's not so dangerous if it's passed on orally. You won't get in as much trouble for it. Mm-hmm. That's a good observation. You get in trouble when you start writing because then other people see it, it becomes public, yeah. And that's when the government comes down on you.
Yeah.
So the oral tradition becomes a subterfuge, a way of undermining the power structure without confronting it.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, good idea.
It makes me think too of the, the father in the other story, this idea of like, but we have to survive. Right, like this writing is, sort of seen as antithetical to that survival, the same way that, broadcasting publicly on the radio,
Yes.
was antithetical to that. And you've got this generation who's like, no, like, yeah, like we may not always like morally or ethically be, making the decisions that we wish we could make, but like we're still going to be here, like we're going to survive.
Yeah, and that danger to writing is clearly marked, right? When writers don't leave any mark in the world, not the world where we are from. In our world, writers are tortured and killed if they are men, called lying horse, then raped and killed if they are women, right? So there is danger to writing that's communicated, and yeah. So in that sense, yeah, it's a matter of survival, right? I think one of my favorite Haitian writers is Danny Laferriere, who is Haitian Canadian, and he talks about he had to escape during Baby Dog's dictatorship to go and live in Canada. And in one of his long poems, right, called "The Enigma of the Return," he talks about this. The fact that as a writer, he could either stay in Haiti or be killed, or escape and live in the diaspora, right? And so, writing is always a threat, right? Including being a literary critic is something that is inherently dangerous. That's definitely captured here. And so, yeah, it makes sense that the oral tradition from that perspective is much safer, yeah.
Maybe we should take a look at the last question. On the last page of Crick Crack, Dantecat dedicates her book to many women who influenced her. There's a whole list of them. It goes on for a page, but the last one is Paul Marshall, whom she calls the greatest kitchen poet of all. So why do you think she likes Marshall so much, pays her such homage at this point, and then by describing her as one of those kitchen poets? What do you think? I'm looking for connections, I guess, between these two writers we've been talking about. What might draw the younger one to dedicate her book to the older one?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think there's the connection that even Joanne mentioned earlier, with the younger generation. She's in that apartment, and we talk about the painting and whatnot, John, that you mentioned, and this idea of like that main character kind of making a record, in painting of, the previous generations, and, kind of keeping that from being lost, and so I could see where, Dantecat would be attracted by that, or feel herself, kind of a kindred spirit with Marshall, because she's doing the same here, for her mother and her ancestors.
Yeah.
And Marshall is even one of her foremothers. Then she's identifying her as one of those persons who told stories to me through writing, in this case, and then I'm passing them on. Yeah. Other ideas? What connections?
That whole idea of Dantecat talks about the need for women to never lose touch with one another, and that's why she writes, or that, and that's what that kitchen poetry is about. And perhaps the person, again, because she was her foremother, she read and she learned from Paul Marshall the attitudes and the commitment and the struggle to continue to write, because it was so important, and it was keeping the generation, or the strings of women communicating with one another strong. And maybe Polly Marshall was her first and strongest influence that inspired her to do what she does. And I can't imagine if she had read anything of Marshall's that she wouldn't have gone, wow, I want to do that. Even though her mother says, no, you can't do that.
Other similarities?
Certainly in their trajectories, right? Coming, their migration story, right?
Yeah.
Coming to the United States from a space in the Caribbean and that Caribbean American identity that they both encapsulate, and that unique perspective, right? That gives them, yeah.
And I think they both have the awareness of the horrors of the colonial past. Mm-hmm. And the Middle Passage. I mean, I hear that lurking in really the Children of the Sea, certainly, where even the guy says this is how they went to the bathroom on the slave ships too, I guess. Or he's identifying this as a kind of Middle Passage, a journey that's not going to end well. And so there's, the Caribbean, the United States, the European colonialists, and then the African roots too that come in. I think both authors really are tuned into all of those 4 points on the map.
All right. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion, like always. It is 8:12 according to my clock. So although we're not a huge stickler for time, it's probably time to wind down. So John, Mitch, what are your final parting comments? Anything that you want to make sure that we think about as we go on?
Well, I'm just glad that I was able to participate in this awesome conversation, and I've had so much fun, so, thank you for having me, and this has been a wonderful pleasure, and I just, this, obviously it's a hobby of mine discussing texts like this, so just anytime I can do it with, and have a good time, I'm always up for it, yeah.
We'll keep that in mind for sure.
Can we ask you to just give us a little bit of background on yourself and what you do and what your education is?
Sure. Yes. So I am. I'm a little bit about my background. So I'm born in Kenya, but I've lived a little bit of everywhere. I lived in Kenya from the age of 8, and then my parents, my mother in particular, migrated to France. So I grew up for most of my childhood in France. I was for a little bit in Uganda. I did my, bachelor's and first master's degree in Sweden because my family also migrated to Sweden later. And then, I came to study in the United States for my second master's and PhD at Penn State. And my focus is on comparative literature, but I'm especially because of my own background, right? I've been being uprooted from one country to the other. I've always been intrigued about questions of Black transnationalism, people who travel from one country to the other, how ideas of Blackness get to be articulated across cultural contexts, which is also very much part of my experience, of thinking about Blackness and Black identity in France versus Sweden versus Kenya versus the United States. So Uganda, all these different places I've lived extensively. And so that is what I study, teach, and research. And those are some of the, the questions that always occupy my mind when I read texts like this, yeah.
Well, that's far more interesting than anything I could say. So I just want to thank everybody for being part of this discussion, and particularly thank Mitch for such a lively and worthwhile contribution to our discussion tonight.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. Thank you. So it makes me wonder, because I read a book a couple years ago called Americana.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's so that it's, and I don't remember the author's name, but
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
thank you. So that would be
Yes.
something that you would be interested in, and
Oh,
thinking
absolutely.
about studying. Okay.
yes,
Well, this is
yeah.
good to know. I'm going to file that away. But
Oh,
all
I
right.
would love it. I love that book.
I hear the
Okay.
semicolon club calling.
I think. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you all again for joining us at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online, and look for the readings and links for next month's discussion, which, John, you're going to remind us is?
Lessons from 3 Black writers to keep in mind during the holiday season.
There you go. All right. So
What writers?
Langston Hughes, ZZ Packer, and who's the third one? Oh, Tony K. Bambara.
okay. All right. So we will see you all again in a month. And again, look for our upcoming, all the stuff that's coming in 2022. And if you haven't been over to the house recently, you really need to get over here and look at the restoration project that is still ongoing and the upgrades to our bookstore furniture. Yes, very nice. But all right. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll talk later.